As he mentioned, this first session is my fault. He was actually more generous to me than he needed to be. So what I queued up was not a question. I actually just delivered an opinion. And some people didn't agree with that opinion. So we're back to talk about it more this year. So I actually went back and looked at my remarks to remind myself more exactly what I said. So I was in a panel on the macroeconomic effects of antitrust policy, and I concluded with a couple points. One was that I thought the expected value of the expected social value of the marginal antitrust case was positive. We should be doing more of it. But that if you added it all up and you did the optimal amount of antitrust policy, so the marginal value of the social value of the marginal case was 0, that might add up to a couple tenths of a percentage point a year of growth, not a percentage point or more percentage points than that. Basically saying it mattered, but it wasn't that big. Now, to be honest, that was introspective. I haven't done any research on it, and I wasn't aware of sharp work that had done such work. So it was just working off of my sort of background knowledge of the literature. I said I'd be happy to have my mind changed if there was evidence to the contrary, and maybe my mind will be changed this morning. We'll see. That's kind of why we're here to talk about it. I'm still very open-minded about the issue, but that's kind of the theme underlying everything. All right, so I don't want to get in the way here of our fantastic panel. So first, let me briefly introduce them to you, and then the way we're going to run the panel is each one of them will be giving about 7 minutes of remarks, and then I will be prompting them with a few questions after their remarks, and then we'll open it to the audience for discussion for the balance of the panel's time. Okay, so to my immediate left is Ufuk Akcigit. He is I got to look up the titles, the Arnold Harburger Professor of Economics at the department here. Ufuk is one of the world's experts in the macroeconomics of, I guess, technology, innovation, and productivity is how I would describe it. And he is a much better mathematical modeler than I am. Next to Ufuk is Chiara Criscuolo. She is currently on secondment from the OECD, where she usually runs productivity analysis. She's at the IFC, part of the World Bank Group. And what's your title, Chiara? I'm sorry? Lead economist. Okay. And she is a much better mathematical modeler than I am. Next to Chiara is Dan Gross. Dan is the assistant professor at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke. I don't know if we're allowed to have this or certainly say this, but I'll just say it. When I was editor at RAND, he was one of my favorite authors to get a submission from. He writes fascinating studies on the history of technological progress and technological diffusion, so he's very well matched to the topic of the panel. And he's also a much better mathematical modeler than I am. Next to Dan is Tommaso Valletti. Tommaso is professor of economics at the Imperial College Business School. He was chief economist of the European Commission from 2016 to 2019, so has particular expertise not just in the theory but in the practice of antitrust policy. And he's a much better modeler than I am. And finally, but not least, of course, at the end of the table, we have John Van Reenen. John is the Ronald Coase Chair. I've heard of Ronald Coase. Yeah, he's some pretty well-known guy. At the Ronald Coase Chair of Economics and School Professor at the Department of Economics at the LSE. John's written immense amounts about all sorts of stuff that the rest of us have drawn from in our own work. But probably, well, I don't even want to say specific things because that would be unfairly narrowing the scope of work John's done. So it's great to have him on the panel. And you might not know this, but he is also a better mathematical modeler than I am. All right. Now that we've had introductions, we're going to go in the same order. It happens to be alphabetical, so we'll just run down the table. I ask you to please keep your comments to 7 minutes. I'll show you 1 minute. I'll show you 0 minutes. And if you go much past further, I'll show you a different finger. All right. Ufuk, go ahead. Thank you.
Sounds great. Thanks, everyone, for coming. And thanks to the organizers for organizing such a fantastic platform to discuss this very important issue. So what I would like to do is I would like to share some of the important findings from our research that can potentially shed light on today's and tomorrow's debate. And let me start with a very bird's eye view, a macro approach to the whole problem. So when we look at the R&D, business R&D to GDP ratio since 1980, it went up from almost 0.5% to 2.5%, a five-fold increase. And if we look at the overall R&D spending, include other federal spending and other type of spending too, then the number goes up from 2% to 3.5%. So a massive increase in the R&D effort in the United States economy. Any growth model would tell you that if we invest more in R&D, we should grow faster. And if anything, since 1980, especially post-2000, what we have received in return instead has been, if anything, it's been a productivity slowdown. So then clearly, something doesn't add up here. Either the theories are wrong, or we have to look more carefully to the data. So, of course, we are investing in R&D in order to come up with new technologies. But at the end of the day, R&D is some abstract spending. What we are effectively doing is we are hiring researchers to deliver those technologies. And I think it is an important question to see what happens to the inventors for us to understand what happens to the R&D and its implications. So we've done a lot of work on the allocation of inventors by merging inventors on patent files and the census data. And here is the first graph that I would like to share with you. It's relatively new. Since 2000, the fraction of inventors who are producing patents in the United States, the fraction of them working for incumbents, here I'm defining incumbents as those firms that are older than 20 years and have more than 1,000 employees, the fraction of inventors went up from 48% to 58%. So there's a massive migration of inventors from smaller, younger firms to incumbent firms. Okay, this itself could be an interesting time series. Should we be worried about this? Well, there's already a lot of evidence showing that small and young firms are much more innovative. They are producing much more radical patents, etc. I worked on this with Bill Kerr, and many other people have done a lot of work on this. But let's specifically look at the inventors. Okay, given that we are talking about inventors, let's look at the inventors. So here, I'm showing you an event study where an inventor, the same person, changes a job. Okay, we take two twin inventors in the data. I can go into details over the coffee break if you're interested. You take two twin inventors, and one of them moves to a large incumbent. The other one moves to a young and small company at time zero. By construction, since they are twin, they are very similar in observable. So that's why before time zero, everything is identical between them. But when an inventor moves to a large incumbent, two things happen. First, after moving to a large incumbent, the wages of the person who is moving to a large incumbent increase by about 12%, a massive bump into compensation. Well, we might say because this person becomes more productive and that's why he's being or she's being compensated for it. Unfortunately, when we look at the patent production of this person after moving to a large incumbent, it declines by 6%. So it's not increasing. So clearly, here we are seeing that, after moving to a large incumbent, productivity and compensations are going exactly in the opposite direction. This is one evidence that we saw from the US economy, but we had another study where we tried to look at what happens when a firm gains more market power. And we looked at the Italian economy and we asked a very simple question. As the firm becomes the dominant market leader, what happens to the innovativeness of the company? Does it innovate more? When we look at the data, the maroon colors are patents per labor, per size. Innovativeness is decreasing. So number one here is the market leader. So we take 20 largest firms in any market and we rank them. 1 is the market leader, 20 is the smallest among those largest 20 firms. So when you go from left to right, firm size is decreasing. So what we are seeing is that market leaders are much less innovative relative to their size. And then what do they do in return? They are hiring more local politicians. So being local politician is a part-time job. So these people are allowed to work for a company at the same time. So they can be both a local politician, being mayor, vice mayor, council member in a municipality, but they can also be on payroll of a company. And what we see is that the yellow dots are showing that market leaders are hiring disproportionately more local politicians. So indeed, these two facts are not totally surprising to us coming from a theory background because, as Chad mentioned, this is a basic Arrow's replacement effect. So if I'm the dominant market leader, I have much less incentive to do something radical. But if I'm new to the market, I need to prove myself to customers and to the market. I need to do something really radical to prove myself. So as a result, when we think about firm interventions or, industrial policy, this is an important aspect to take into account. Not every firm has the same incentive. Indeed, how do we influence the economy through our policies? So I think this is a really big question. Of course, antitrust policies are typically trying to resolve the problem ex post, but what are we doing ex ante? And I think this is an important question. And R&D tax credit, for instance, is a very important and super popular policy that's being implemented. And here, this is a very fresh result that we calculated using the U.S. Census data. And the take-up rate of R&D tax credit is increasing very sharply as firm size increases. So, of course, when we think about, providing support, small firms seem to be doing more radical things, creating more spillovers, looking at the citations, for instance, that they produce or the subsequent innovation effort. If anything, looking at the data, if we are going to correct for the spillovers, missing spillovers seem to be coming more from smaller firms. But when we look at the government policy at this R&D tax credit, it's being mostly taken up by large firms. Are the two related? So again, let's remember these hires where when I hire somebody, wages go up and productivity goes down of the person. Let's call it a red flag hire. What we see in the data also, I didn't bring it into a graph, but what we see in the data very strongly is that if we look at the hiring patterns of the firms, those firms that are more prone to do bad hires, they are also more likely to utilize R&D tax credit in the data at the firm level. So as a result, I think it is important for us to go back and go back to the drawing board and ask ourselves, are the ex-ante policies leading to the rise in concentration, which later on makes us think about antitrust policies? So I think we have to resolve the problem at its source. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Ufuk. Chiara.
So thank you, Chad, and thanks to the Stigler Center for inviting me. Let me say that I thought we wouldn't be controversial, but I think we will. I should say that whatever I say here today reflects my own view, not the OECD, not the IFC. So, if you have complaints, come to me. Let me say that, as was discussed already, innovation and competition is quite a tricky relationship already from a theoretical point of view, where there is this sort of, I would say, contention between the ex-ante need of having a competitive environment and the ex-post need of rewarding, sort of giving some monopoly power to the innovators for his investment. Now, what is also tricky, and probably even more, I would say, is the measurement. And Ufuk just looked at some measures or some proxies of innovation, but I would say there is even more contention when you look at measures of competition, and Chad has a very nice paper discussing this. And this is, I think, also where there is a lot of tension between what I call the antitrust community and the rest, perhaps, of us, who need to rely on data from large cross-country databases, which is what we do at the OECD. What we did in a recent large amount of work with colleagues at the OECD, Sarah Calligaris, Michelle Chavez, Josh DeLion, Andrea Greppi, and Oliviero Palanca, I want to mention them all because it was a huge amount of work, is we delivered new proxies of the state of concentration across 23 mainly European countries over 2 decades between 2000 and 2019. And what we try to do is really to look at different proxies, concentration and markup, but to correct for some of the, I would say, contentious problems that exist, and in particular trying to measure the geographical reach of markets by looking at domestic versus European versus global markets. We also try to look at the correlation between what we measure, which is already much more detailed than in previous work at the 3-digit level, with product market, sort of taking data from sales at the market level for consumer goods, and then looking not only at concentration in a static level, but also looking at measures of entrenchment, market share instability, and rank persistence. So we really did a huge amount of work over a long time period. So let me tell you what the results are. I cannot show you graphs because the paper is still under embargo, so we will be presented at the end of June at the European Commission. So with all this robustness, one important result is that what we measure at the 3-digit level is actually strongly correlated with what we measure at the product market level. So that's, I would say, an initial good news. The second thing is all the indicators, whether we look at markup and concentration, are actually correlated, and they all go in the same direction in the sense that the trends all show a weakening of the state of competition. And this weakening of the state of competition is much stronger in domestic market. And in fact, we find that openness and globalization, which is seen these days a bit as an enemy, actually has been quite good at keeping a more competitive environment. Now, the big question that I think is the second source of discussion is what is driving this trend in concentration, in markups, especially at the top of the distribution. Is this for what we call good reasons, sort of structural changes, the digital transformation, the increased reliance on intangible assets, or is it for what we could call the bad reasons, sort of, I would say, weak antitrust, increased market powers at the top? And the answer is that both are at play. This is something that was found also in the US already before by, for example, Cruzet and Eberly, and by John and others. So what we find is that sectors that rely more on intangible assets and on digital technologies, these are the sectors that have seen higher increase in concentration, higher increase in markups, especially at the top. But we also see that the acquisition, the level of acquisition done by the top players actually play an important role in explaining the increase in concentration. So, and I will come back to this, but this is where I think antitrust authorities really have a role to play. What about globalization? It is true that in sectors that are more intangible intensive and more digital intensive, working in an open environment actually raises the gains for the top players. So this is really a winner-takes-all dynamics in the way that John and David Ozer have described in their work. Now, what are the consequences? I mean, let me show you some results on the markup that I can show you because this was pre this work. We see that there is this increasing dispersion that has been documented also for the US by Jan de Locker and Eckhout, and more recently by Jan and John for the UK. Now, what are the consequences? And this is, I think, quite important. The same sectors where we see an increase in concentration, we see an increase in the dispersion of total factor productivity. We also see a decline in entry rate, and we see a decline in labor share, especially amongst the top firms. This is, again, confirming evidence that was found in the US. So one big question is how much this is worrying or not. First of all, we see an increase in entrenchment, as I said, across, especially in the most concentrated industry. So these firms have a way of defending their position. And in fact, in previous work with Matej Bagar and Jonathan Timis, we have found that they use, and this is in line with your evidence as well, Ufuk, they use much more defensive patents. Now, let me be more controversial. So one positive news is that we find that antitrust authorities do play a role, and in those sectors that see a stronger intervention by European Commission, we also see a decline as a negative correlation with the increase in concentration. But let me mention another policy that I want to show that everything is correlated. When we think about innovation policy, and Ufuk said it, R&D tax credit is the most used policy. And one point that I would like to make, Ufuk focused on the US, but there is a lot of heterogeneity in the design of these policies. And in fact, what we find is that the effectiveness of R&D tax credit is much stronger for SMEs. And we also find that it's much stronger for SMEs when the R&D tax credit has, allows for refundability or does not focus on profits, i.e. Gives payroll tax breaks. So what do we find in our data actually is that there is a negative correlation between the increase in support to R&D, using R&D tax credit, and the concentration. So what you see, and I mean you see there, in those countries where we have an increase in public support through R&D tax credit, we also see a decline in concentration of R&D, and the opposite is true. So we really see a bit the opposite of what you were finding, that the more R&D tax credit is used, the less concentration of R&D you find across countries. And as I said, this effect is stronger when refundability clauses are allowed, and where, I should also say, at the top, there are binding ceiling for large firms in terms of R&D. Now, the problem is that there has been a resurgence in new industrial policies, and R&D tax credit are clearly not enough if we want to use innovation to really meet the climate neutrality target or meet other very important societal challenges. And so there is more and more use of new industrial policy subsidies. And this is where, again, design and the whole of government approach, where we integrate innovation ministries and antitrust policies, is particularly important, and where we focus not only on the top, but also on diffusion of technologies across the whole population. So let me stop here.
Thank you, Chiara. Next, we have Dan. Dan, we'll get your slides.
Okay, and is this thing on? We're good? Great. Okay, excellent. Well, it's a pleasure to be here in good company, no less. And as Chad said, I've done a lot of work really thinking about technology and historical perspective in the 20th century, sometimes intersecting with competition antitrust, actually often not, which is why I have a lot to learn here too. But I have, I think I was charged with is maybe providing a little bit of fodder for conversation. Took that to mean maybe I could instigate a little bit too. So we're going to work through some examples in the next few minutes that maybe will be useful later as well. And I should say, I mean, imagine coming to Chicago and getting 7 uninterrupted minutes to talk. I don't know what to do. I didn't know what to do at that time until I had to sit down and think about it. So, okay, so here we go. The motivating question really for the next few minutes, that as I'm thinking about it, is does antitrust promote or inhibit the invention and diffusion of GPT-like technology, which is where we started, right? And I'm going to start with what might be kind of the canonical example of a GPT in the 20th century, the transistor, modern critical technology today. Invented in 1947 at Bell Labs. This is kind of often viewed as an example or a testament to the firm's innovative capabilities, the potential power of undirected corporate science. And then what's often not presented or kind of reflected on as much is this question: why were AT&T scientists working on transistors, solid-state physics to begin with? And my interpretation of this history is that, and it's documented too, not just an interpretation, a lot of this had to do with internal demand. I mean, AT&T was running a national telephone network. It was massive. Conducting telephone calls over long distances requires constant amplification of electrical signals. And at the time, that was run on vacuum tubes. Vacuum tubes were just not an adequate technology to do this at scale. Engineers at the company projected they'd have to consume the entire U.S. energy output to support the future telephone network on vacuum tubes. What they needed was a low-power, more reliable amplification technology. That turned out to be the transistor. That turned out to be the transistor. And we're reflecting that, really, Mervyn Kelly, the director of Bell Labs, actually had multiple folks working on this problem with different angles of attack. And what came out of it was solid-state transistors and ultimately, of course, semiconductors from there. So one way to view this story is actually as putting points in the column for integration being conducive to GPT-like technology, the internal market that AT&T presented, and the way it can internalize externalities of that innovation were present. Now, to be clear, and this will be a running theme in the next few minutes, I don't have a good counterfactual. This would be the case for GPTs broadly because they're intrinsically rare. And if not AT&T would have been another firm, right? There were some supply side factors that made this kind of a good moment in time for this kind of technology to emerge. We'll talk about that later. But okay, so one example in front of us. Let me put another one. The next one is tractors. And so tractors I see as kind of the GPT of agriculture. They do essentially everything across the value chain in agriculture, today at least. You know, these are machines that tow and power implements that actually do the day-to-day work of plowing, planting, cultivating, harvesting. But the thing is, they were actually pretty slow to diffuse in the 20th century, and there's been work written on this from various angles. One of my own papers does it too, kind of concerning the technology problem. This is the one that Chad edited years ago, which was a lovely experience, Chad. And
I'll give you your money a little later, Dan. Thanks.
Yeah, right. We'll talk about this later. And so, you know, the story kind of presents an initial mystery or question. Why did it take so long, right? Given the productivity impacts they had on the sector. And when you dive into the history, a lot of it really comes down to a technology problem, an innovation problem. Early tractors, they just couldn't do all that much. They were behemoths, right? You're looking at one right there. They're massive, hard to maneuver. They destroy the crops as you roll over them. And so it really wasn't until a few decades later that tractors emerged with more versatile features, where they looked more like this: smaller, lighter weight. You could adjust the width of the wheels. They could navigate row crops. It had power takeoff to power implements, the complements that get used with them, and more. And so now, of course, they're used in essentially all stages of the field production. You know, this is an example that I think really embodies the principles of Bresnahan and Trachtenberg quite well, in a more dynamic way, perhaps, because you can see it evolve over time. First, for high-value use cases with existing complements. Later, as complements were co-invented, co-developed, it evolved versatility. And so why is this relevant today? Well, the nugget here is that the firm that first developed a general-purpose tractor was International Harvester. And International Harvester, before tractors, was the leading implement maker in the United States. And this meant that in developing tractors, right, it internalized innovation externalities through in the form of the complementarity between the GPT in the middle and the complements around it. And so this maybe puts other points in that column for integration. So I'm going to run through, since we're short on time, I'm going to run through this example very quickly. Penicillin, a GPT of modern medicine, right? Antibiotics broadly, general purpose in treating infectious disease, infections in general. And penicillin was a stuck R&D problem in the 20th century. And of course, this is important because I mean, medical technology has improved standards of living, ultimately delivered as much value, roughly speaking, roughly estimated, as productivity-enhancing technologies over the last century as well, just in extending lifespans, right? And so penicillin was first discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928. Its chemical composition first established in 1939, but there was really no way to, no means of producing this at scale. It was a stuck problem until World War II got the technology out of that problem, particularly through a kind of coordinated industrial effort to develop methods for producing penicillin at scale. And the reason why this is interesting here is because the degree of collaboration and coordination that this involved in industry would have violated antitrust restrictions at the time. This required DOJ waivers in order to share information, to coordinate production. And of course, it's an exceptional circumstance. I'm not claiming this is general. It's a time of war. But another example in front of us. So let me move very quickly. I'm going to give a couple of quick notes on IBM unbundling, not to preempt too much the panel later. this is going to push in the other direction because I do want to have some countervailing evidence, right? IBM unbundled hardware and software in 1969. They announced it in 1968. At the time, facing real antitrust pressure, DOJ had already begun its investigation. It announced it began its lawsuit about a month after IBM announced. But this is broadly credited with kind of spurring the takeoff of the third-party software market, which is, of course, enormous today. And so this question lingers, right? Is DOJ pressure what led IBM to unbundle? And the truth is, I don't think there's good evidence on this. We'll hear more about this later, perhaps. Interpretations, again, are mixed. Some folks say, look, it wasn't antitrust pressure. It was really the rising cost of providing software support. Others say there's no way unbundling planners at IBM could have avoided this issue. This is top of mind. And so, questions like this, again, at the very least, the correlation is provocative, suggestive that antitrust pressure mattered. So where does this leave all of us? This is where I'll tie off. Kind of a step back synthesis of this, right? So back to the core question. Does antitrust promote or inhibit GPT-like technology? I think there's ambiguity in economics, in the historical record. There's some evidence of value integration, coordination in some cases, but also benefits antitrust in others. And so the way that I've made sense of this so far, but of course this is for you all to debate and think about, is that this kind of points me to the classical trade-off between static and dynamic efficiency, where integration can be good for invention, but maybe antitrust can promote diffusion and co-invention. And to be clear, these cases lack counterfactuals. And so what we really need, or what we're left with kind of wanting, is a good theory of the case that can allow us to make better inference. So I will close it there. Thank you. And let's pass it over to Tommaso.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. And next we have Tommaso.
Thank you very much. And good morning, everybody. It's always a pleasure to be here. It's my favorite conference on the other side of the Atlantic. So I tried to respond to the challenge that Chad gave us last year. And I'll start with some fairly uncontroversial points. And I will disappoint you. I will not have a lot of controversial points today, but I'll try to make a couple at least. So the relationship between competition and productivity. This is not antitrust and productivity, but competition. This is the uncontroversial. I think many of us, if not all of us, agree that competition helps with productivity growth a lot. There is a discussion on which could be the mechanisms that could do that. Typically, they are grouped under three categories. Competition may be good for growth because it forces firms at being more efficient. So there's a discipline effect or a treatment effect. Competition in itself is good. It creates better firms. There is another possibility. These are not mutually exclusive. That is more a selection effect where firms are born good and bad. Okay, so competition in itself doesn't change the productivity of firms, but through the market interaction, a sort of Darwinian process that only the efficient will stay and the less efficient will disappear. And finally, and this is a bit more controversial, I will return at the end if I've got the time, there is also the possibility that competition is good for innovation. This is a bit more of a question mark. There's a lovely paper by Bacchus a few years back. There was a PhD chapter of Matt, and it does test explicitly for the first two mechanisms, this treatment versus a selection effect in a special industry, which is cement. So it doesn't do innovation. You wouldn't expect cement to be a highly innovative industry, which is fair enough. And although the mechanisms, as I said, are not mutually exclusive, it does find that the data are saying it's pretty much consistent with the first story. So competition forces firms at being better, more efficient, perhaps who have a better managerial effort, specialization, etc. It doesn't find much evidence consistent with the second story, which, by the way, if you think a bit more deeply, these already have some antitrust implications. So competition as such seems to be good. Now, but what's the link with antitrust enforcement, which was the challenge of, because that's it, this is uncontroversial. I think most of us will agree with those points, and then the specific application to cement we can discuss. What about the link to antitrust enforcement? Actually, there is some evidence there. It's and I'll present only two papers to findings. One paper that is incredibly popular among policymakers, and it's fairly unknown among academics, despite being published in a very reputable journal, which is the Review of Economics and Statistics. I've put all the authors because somebody should have a research program to understand why Italians are so obsessed with competition. So all of them are Italians, and with the exception of one, none of them has a job in Italy now. So it is an empirical regularity I've seen over many, many years. So what they find, they do an empirical study, large, so one of them, Cristiana, is at the OECD, so a colleague of Chiara. They look at different countries. I said 12 plus 1 because one is the EU, which is not a country in itself, but you have interesting data also at that level across many industries, 22 over a long enough period of time. They construct indices of policy intervention, competition policy index. This is specific to antitrust. They apply good econometric techniques. They always try to instrument, and they do find overall that antitrust matters for TFP growth, so the growth of total factor productivity, which is a real effect in our economy. So that's a nice finding. The recent instead paper by Babin et al. And Sinka Barkai is here in the audience. He presented some preliminary results last year. These are something happened to the format of my slides, but what they're doing there is also they're looking at a large set of interventions by the DOJ in the US. And they do, again, a very nice study looking at states which had a certain intervention in a certain industry, and they compare with neighboring states that didn't have the same intervention or in the same industry, and they find large output effects. So they found that output goes up by 5%. There are more people which are hired as a consequence of the antitrust intervention, and they also find I don't remember. What's the other thing? Yep. Permanent increase, more entry, exactly, more entry after the intervention. It's great to have you here. Thank you so much. So these is pointing to some real effects of antitrust. If you look at the data that they have, and they do the best they can, basically most of the action comes from cartels. And there are a few local mergers. They don't have a control group for large national mergers because you don't have a state you can compare with. So if anything, perhaps we're just picking on the smaller things rather than big things. So perhaps they're even underestimating. Case studies I won't remember because there is a whole conference today devoted to this, but there are case studies. At the macro level, huge literature of Ufuk and others have contributed to this. But there are also two specific things related to antitrust. So there's all this literature on Schumpeterian and endogenous growth, which is not focused on antitrust intervention. However, the EC, where I worked for a couple of years, they do have a macroeconomic model, which is done actually by DG ECFIN. This is the finance people, okay? It's not done by DG Comp. It's done by other guys, and they can estimate the impact that competition policy has on growth, and they do find a real effect there in the range of 0.5 percentage point to 1 percentage point. So this is the magnitude that Chad wouldn't believe, but this is through simulations. There is a wonderful recent paper that I'm sure Ufuk is very familiar with by Kavenai, Chelik, and Tian. They have a research agenda, which is super interesting. And this is in the Journal of Monetary Economics, which is not the typical journal I would be reading because I'm an industrial economist. But they do have a model of Schumpeterian growth where there is a possibility of finding through the model the probability that mergers happen and the probability that mergers are actually blocked. They call it obstruction by the antitrust authorities. And in the counterfactual, they can simulate what happens if you forget about antitrust. Okay, you get away, and what happens instead if you increase antitrust. And again, they find large effects. So let me wrap up this on one message, which is how come we cannot convince Chad if it seems that competition is good, it should have real effects, and instead Chad is not convinced because we don't see enough in the data. And my take on this is that antitrust intervention is great for several reasons, but we have done very little of it. So we see very little of it in the data because we haven't done a Section 2 enforcement for 20 years. We analyze like a bunch of mergers per year. Even if we're doubling the intervention rate, this is not going to have an impact. So we don't have big effects, observed effects, not because antitrust is ineffective, because we have done not much of it. The last point I want to mention, which is more of I think it's important for this audience, specific to innovation and mergers. If you ask many economists, they will start with the inverted U of Philippe Aghion and others, which is coming from an older paper in the QG. That was empirical evidence, by the way, on the inverted U. Okay. If you see what's in this picture, you have some measure of innovation, some patents on the vertical axis. Horizontally, they have a measure of the markups. The point I want to make, this is not about mergers. So we have to rethink again that what Aghion said, because otherwise the policy people immediately say when it comes to merger and innovation, we don't know, anything goes. So we did lots of work at the agrochemical. Again, this is an industry that economic historians should be studying because there has been an incredible consolidation over time. So this was from 50 down to 6 firms in the late 2010, and because of the merger wave that we analyzed at the EC, Dow, DuPont, Bayer, Monsanto, and also ChemChina, Syngenta, now we got 4. Okay, super consolidation. But we realized that the literature on innovation was not about mergers, and mergers about the unilateral effects that when you are suppressing basically the competition between two merging parties is going to happen later on. So we did a work we didn't have the time to publish in elite journals because we were running cases. So, but in the IGIO with Giulio and Greg, we had this result, which was, in the absence of efficiencies and uninternalized spillovers, this is the important thing. So in the absence of those, mergers reduce consumer surplus even in the presence of innovation. So the same type of unilateral effects that we do apply to prices, we can run it also a sort of similar presumption when it comes to innovation, which is something that lots of people try to discredit, and as of 2024, no one has found alternatives yet. So my suggestion when it comes to mergers is perhaps change this inverted U approach that we have, generally speaking, for other questions related to innovation, but not specific to mergers. This is a paper in the Aris Review of Economic Studies by Igame and Watsaken on hard disk drives, where they do structural modeling of unilateral effects in a high-tech industry. And that's, you probably don't see, but you see that as you reduce the number of firms through a merger, in a continuous way, innovation goes down. Perhaps we should replace the inverted U with this other curve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tommaso. And now, John.
So thanks very much. And thanks to the organizers for putting me on last in this session. So by this point, I guess all the good and interesting points have been made. So I'm left to the residual claimant of the bad and boring points. So I will seek to live down to that aspiration. So here we go. So I want to make 3 broad points, I guess, in relation to Chad's question. One over the kind of general macro picture on productivity. The second specifically on the role of competition and antitrust. And the third a kind of I don't know if it's a pushback or maybe my attempt to answer Chad's kind of question. I'm going to focus on productivity growth overall rather than GPTs specifically. So, the reason that productivity growth is extremely important is, that we have had this enormous slowdown in productivity growth across the world. This is latest IMF numbers, just looking at general growth. Since the mid-2000s, we've had a significant fall of the growth rate, and a lot of that has been specifically due to productivity growth. So in the advanced countries, for example, total factor productivity growth is more or less halved between its rate prior to the kind of global financial crisis in the mid-2000s and the rate afterwards. So that's a really, significant fall. And it's behind, I believe, a lot of the kind of big political and social problems that we face today. So let me take my own country, the UK, as an example of this. So had the output per hour growth in the UK continued at the level it had been for the previous 30 years over the last 15 or 16 years since the mid-2000s, the global financial crisis, our overall productivity is about a quarter lower than it would have been had it been continued to growing at that rate. That's a huge chunk of the economy lost. Now, why? Sorry? You can see COVID, the kind of wiggle here is COVID, right? There's the 2020 stuff, but COVID is a heartbeat in this overall position which is happening. So it matters, but it matters less than you might think in the big picture. Now, for ordinary people, why does this matter? When economists talk about productivity, often people drop off to sleep. Well, the reason it matters is that it matters for people's wages. So looking at since 1980 again, productivity is in blue, and I've actually done this pre-COVID just so it doesn't get messed up by COVID, just to be clear, it's up to 2019. Below the kind of productivity line is what's happened to average employee compensation, basically wages. So you can see over this period of about 40 years, in the UK, wages have pretty much followed where productivity has been. Now, it doesn't happen all the time. So in Mrs. Thatcher in the 80s, wages fell behind productivity. Under the kind of Blair years, it kind of caught up again. But since around about 2010, the misery of low productivity growth has been pretty equitably shared between both labour and capital, in fact, across the wage distribution as well. So this is why productivity growth really matters for what we're talking about today. Okay. Second point. Now, I think Tommaso has articulated very well the evidence, which I think there's a consensus on, that tougher product market competition can be a force for raising productivity through the different mechanisms he described: eradication, faster diffusion, probably, I believe, faster innovation as well. Therefore, antitrust policy, which increases product market competition, should qualitatively be a force for raising productivity growth. So I think that that's the kind of prima facie case for why antitrust is important. Now, the issue, and this is the kind of third point, which is Chad's challenge, is that what role does, even if competition matters, what role does antitrust play for that? Because from a policy point of view, and I spend a lot of my time talking to policymakers, increasing competition is more than simply antitrust. It's to do with what's happening with trade, what's happening with openness to foreign investments, what's happening to regulation, what's happening to finance to help growth and entry and scale up the startups. So antitrust is only one part of that, and maybe it's a relatively small part of that which is happening. So I think that's the challenge that Chad posed here. So I think my counter to that would be in kind of three points. So the first one is that even if it's only a relatively small effect, a few tenths of a percentage point is actually pretty damn good when you look at this. The growth of in the British case, we've had about a labour productivity growth rate of about 0.4 percentage points a year. So half a percentage point is very, very good compared to something like 2.5%, 0.4. So even a small amount is pretty good, actually. So I think that's the first kind of point to think about. The way I think, actually, of a kind of strategy or an economic strategy towards raising productivity growth is a series of different things. So it's not just, it's a part of it is raising competition. Part of that is raising competition through stronger, better enforcement of antitrust policy, changing the antitrust policy. A lot of it is other things as well, to do with people's skills, towards overall investments, towards many other things. But antitrust policy is one part of that basket of things that we need to get back to more sustainable productivity growth around the world. Point two, I think the empirics that Tommaso covered are important. Many of those effects are bigger or smaller. I think one example of where antitrust did have a very big negative effect was if you think back to the 1930s, for example, in the US, under the National Industrial Recovery Act, there was exemptions for cartel behavior, and some people think those exemptions actually helped prolong the Great Depression. You can see this in other countries which have really taken a more relaxed approach to cartels, to other forms of antitrust policies. Those can actually have very negative overall effects. So I think there are examples where the effects can be larger. And then finally, I think one thing that I think Chiara hinted at this early on is important to realize at this particular moment that we've had over the last few years, or perhaps even longer, is a retreat from globalization. We're in an era of deglobalization, where countries are putting up tariff barriers and other trade restrictions, which have been important forces for increasing competition, which lies behind some of the empirical evidence Tommaso was saying. There's lots more resistance towards being open to foreign direct investments. There's lots more, potential industrial subsidies, other things coming in. That's a period over which, if we think there's other forces of international competition or competition which help drive productivity are weakened, it's really important from a policy point of view to strengthen domestic competition through antitrust policy in a world where those other forces which we relied on for increasing competition might be in retreat. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Fantastic remarks from the panel to get us started in the discussion today. So I'm going to pick up, drawing from what several of you said, to ask a question to any and all of us on the panel. So here we go. I think it's fair, correct me if I'm wrong, that all of us would read the literature as offering plenty of evidence that competition induces productivity growth, causally. The specific question of the panel is about antitrust policy. And Tommaso mentioned there's not a lot of direct evidence on that in the research literature. Setting aside those papers, if you can measure competition as a scalar and regress it on metrics of antitrust policy, what's the R squared of that thing, and how much of that is causal? And what I'm asking for normal people in the room is basically how much of the variation in the competitiveness of markets is explained by antitrust policy per se, as opposed to other things that we know affects how competitive markets are. I'd like to hear your speculations on the strength of that relationship. Anyone want to pick it up? We could crosstalk, it's fine.
This is it's going to be the topic for next year's conference. we will come with some more evidence about it. I don't have an answer to that, obviously, but taking into account also how much it costs to society to do antitrust enforcement. And we don't put a lot of resources into doing antitrust. So the whole of Europe has 1,000 people which are dealing with the whole of the antitrust and mergers and state aid. It's a collection of 500 million citizens. So, and compared to instead the resources we devote to monetary policy, to independent central banks, which are billions and billions and billions of dollars every year. And they have an impact. It's been estimated that if we can control inflation, this is not the best period to talk about it, of course, but it's about perhaps 0.5 percentage point of GDP, maybe at most 1 percentage point of GDP, the impact of monetary policy, and yet we've invested a lot of resources. So the response to your question is we have some limited but compelling evidence that antitrust works. We also have evidence that we don't do enough, and probably there's been lots of reason, ideology for decades, but also as a consequence of that ideology, we started reducing the amount of resources that enforcers have. This is the typical way if you want to contrast enforcement. You just have the Congress, which is giving less and less money to the enforcers, and this is happening yet again in the US, I understand, and also in Europe. We are not giving more resources for the digital regulation in Europe. Now we have given 40 people, 40, for the whole of digital regulation. So I think the investment into antitrust would have high returns. So I'm flipping your question. So I think investing in antitrust would have high returns. And in particular, if we look at the dynamic impact that antitrust enforcement, business formation, innovation, which to me are orders of magnitude bigger than fixing prices plus minus 3%, 5%, which is what we do most of the time. But the dynamic impact of not allowing entrenchment of market power on innovation, these are large. They have to be larger on the economy. But next year we'll come with an R squared.
So let me pick up that as well. So, of course, it's hard to know. Neither of these are easy scalar things to do.
I get it.
But I think my gut instinct, it'd be great next year we can look at it, is that, the R squared is not super high, and there are much more important things ultimately which might determine competition, such as fundamental forces of technological change, trade type of policies. Those are the things which actually have very large effects. Population density, I believe, on this old cement paper that you made your job market paper on. But it may not matter. I mean, I think what I was trying to articulate is that the way we should think about these things is what is amenable to policy intervention. Many of these things, deep, the gravity equation where you are in trade or technology are very hard to change with policy. This is an area where policymakers can make a difference and actually can do something. So even if the effects in magnitude are not enormous, the fact, A, you can make a policy difference by doing policy, B, it should be part of an overall package like I argued, and C, as Tommaso said, if the cost benefit does it, we should do it. I think that's the way we should think about the question rather than obsess too much about the exact amount of the R squared and the regression.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
As I said, in the results that we have, it works. At least they get the right, I would say, sectors, and it has an effect in the medium to long run on not increasing concentration. I would add one thing, that especially now with these new industrial policies, it is important to have antitrust authorities play a big part in the game, and mainly it's because I think there is a political push towards, we saw it even in Europe, towards sort of, again, going and picking winners and sort of target large incumbents, because that's what you see. And I think having an antitrust authority that might help focus on the role of potential entrants, on the role of competition more generally, even just having that there is quite relevant. So you might not see an effect, but the presence is already a value, I would say.
Okay. Dan?
I can add one thing quickly, just reflecting on the comments so far and partly picking up on what John said in his initial talk too, where he pointed out all of the different factors that can affect competitiveness, entry barriers, trade policy, and antitrust, and more. The point of that statement, right, was that many factors, market and non-market, affect competitiveness, and yet those policy choices aren't always coordinated. I think that's great for empirical study. That's good for identification, but also at least leaves me with less of a sense of the whole as opposed to the parts, and how they interrelate. So just one more thing out there.
Thank you. So before I get to my next question, a very minor correction, but it is my life's mission. My work has mostly been about concrete, not cement.
Sorry, Chad.
Matt Backus's paper is also about concrete instead of cement. And all of you are like, there's a difference? Yeah, there's a difference. Come talk to me at lunch and you're going to learn about the difference between concrete and cement. All right.
That's another.
Everyone makes that conflation. It's fine. I'm having fun. Okay. Next question, also for all of you. Kind of raised by some stuff that Dan said, also a big role in the kind of work that Ufuk has done, which is there, and if so, what is its nature, a difference between innovation of technologies and diffusion of existing technologies? And how do the forces potentially affected by antitrust potentially differentially affect those two things? Or should we think of them as being equally affected in the same direction? Innovation versus diffusion.
So let me take this one. There's a very significant difference. For instance, when we also think about giving policy advice to different countries, let me start again from a macro perspective and then try to go a little bit more micro. When we try to give policy recommendation to countries, we look at their distance to the technology frontier. So if a country is really, really backward, there's no way for a country that's very backward to ask them to open up new R&D labs, to start innovating cutting edge technologies, etc. There's no way for them to innovate. So the first thing they need to do is to imitate, but to make it sound less negative, we tell them to diffuse knowledge in those countries, because imitation is typically perceived negatively for some reason. But as the country gets closer to the frontier, now the institutional structure is very different that's needed to push the frontier forward. You need to have strong universities. You need to have risk-loving financiers. You need to have a very strong human capital that's getting trained in technical things. So that's why the requirement is completely different. So that's the first thing that I wanted to put on the table. But so technology diffusion is needed in any economy. First, somebody has to come up with a technology, but as long as that technology is captured within a single firm, then the economy won't benefit from that. So the technology needs to get diffused. But how will that happen is an important question. Indeed, I might learn from about the new technologies by being in the same region or by doing trade with that firm. But implementing that idea is a second issue. And there, I think the big chunk of the problem emerges. You have a new technology, Chad, and I learn from it and I want to implement it. But as long as you threaten me with your arsenal of patents, which happens very, very heavily in the US, then it's as if knowledge doesn't diffuse. Even if I learn from it, as long as I'm not able to put it into action, it's as if it doesn't diffuse. And when we look at the secondary market activities of market leaders, in 1980, 30% of the patents were being bought by the largest 1% of the firms. Today, that number went up above 65%. A massive concentration in secondary activities by large firms, not necessarily to use them and put them into production of new goods, but it's more to threaten their rivals. And we also know about the killer acquisition stories, and also in the results that I showed about strategic hires from rivals, etc. So, just to relate to your earlier point, we can of course concentrate on the antitrust implementation, but there are so many other ways for companies to get around it and implement, again, things that will lead to market concentration. We need to take a holistic approach here rather than just focusing on antitrust. We need to really look at the bundle of policies. While we are trying to intensify competition, there are so many other policies that are reducing competition and undoing the impact of antitrust policy, I think.
Perhaps two things I would like to add. One is I agree absolutely with Ufuk. It's important to have diffusion. It's also important to have breakthrough innovation. And that's where the entry rates, the sort of potential entrants can play an important role. And we see that has been declining. So that's, I think, one role where, again, antitrust will play a role. The second one that I think links very much to what Ufuk was showing us is the role of non-competes. And that's where I think the mobility of inventors has been shown to be important for the diffusion, not only of technological innovation, but also managerial innovation. That's where, again, I think antitrust authorities can play an important role. And we saw that from many papers that this has played an important role for innovation across the US, but also more recently we saw some evidence in Europe. So I think that's another role for antitrust authorities.
Great. Anything else?
I mean, I guess just on the diffusion innovation thing, I mean, my sense is on competition, it's diffusion, which probably, it has a clear positive effect because of the fact that, if I'm thinking of having a new technology, a very strong incentive to adopt it, as if my rivals, other people are adopting it, I'm going to be left behind. That has a very powerful motivating force on it, as well as the, just simple reallocation type of effect. I think where antitrust comes in more is when we're talking about, say, the more kind of the high-tech innovative type of sectors, which, obviously we care a lot about there. I think the innovation aspects are more important. The theory is more ambiguous. My sense in the empirical literature is generally there's a positive effect. But, of course, Ufuk and I wrote a whole 787-page book.
Yes.
Why it isn't
Yes.
going to be ambiguous. So, we have
Now available
we have to
at
keep the academic industry mill grinding for books.
That's
not,
great.
Not quite as simple as that.
Great.
Yeah, just to follow on with one last thought, right? I brought up the tensions between static and dynamic efficiency at the end of my spiel in the context of antitrust, but that really is at the essence of patent policy too. I've actually been more discussed in that context than in antitrust, I think, where the same levers that incentivize invention also, by providing temporary monopoly, right, also limit diffusion and subsequent invention. And balancing those forces, walking that line, right, has been a challenge for ages. And of course, there are choices that can be made in that context, right, patent terms and scope and things like that. In the antitrust context, what are the levers to walk that line? is maybe even a better question for Tommaso than for me. But I think that tension is there. And I think it's evident, at least to me, in some of the examples that I walked through. And so understanding the trade-offs and prioritizing one or the other, it's a tough question for me to think about.
Thank you. I'll add to that. I'm largely in agreement with what's been said. But competition policy in particular, as John said, is great for diffusion, not just for imitation, but because also it's much more banal. If there's competition among producers of technology, the price of that technology becomes cheaper and more people are going to adopt it. On the innovation side and the alleged trade-off, you have to be careful. So if you want to go back to this innovation theory of harm, competition policy is also helping on innovation as such, because firms compete by being better, no? And I'm trying to steal away. The auto replacement effect happens also on the innovation side, unless there are strong positive spillovers. So I think something that we have to account for empirically is the presence of spillovers. When I innovate, is it just something I can appropriate, or do I give an advantage to other rivals as well? So in industries which are pretty much easy to appropriate, like you can do patenting, so pharmaceutical, the agrochemical, I would think that these spillovers are not very relevant empirically. In other industries that they might be more relevant. On what Dan said, and again I agree on the tension between static and then dynamic, but something which is missing in our discussion, perhaps it will come in the case studies later on today, is that there are waves. There are waves. You can see that clearly some concentration has been good, innovation has created, but at some stage these monopolists who became too big, they started blocking everything else. So bringing in some oxygen, and we can talk about whether it was causal or not, but through breaking up AT&T and Microsoft, and now the tech giants. I mean, you see that every 30 years, every 25 years, there's been something disruptive for 10, 15, then monopolization for 10, 15, then we discussed how to undo it. And we see these waves, and these waves are pretty much present if you have an historical description of the high-tech industries, and we should discuss that.
Just one thing real quick in what you said too that's interesting to me, that also picks up on the early thing I said, is that antitrust, the effects of antitrust depend also on the shape of other policies like patent policy, right? And so understanding intersection interactions, it's not something that I understand well enough yet, and maybe there's more work to be done there, but it stood out to me in what Tommaso said too.
Great. Last question for the panel before we go to the audience, so have your questions ready. Ufuk's empirical work that he presented raised very explicitly a connection between market power and political power. And so, I'm not sure how economists think about that. I think it might be different than policymakers, but maybe not. I'd like to hear your thoughts. What is the relationship? How strong is it? Antitrust is sort of built theoretically around market power. Is it a tool also for addressing political power, or should it not be used for that? Are there other tools that should be used to think about that? I guess that's the theme. Anyone want to pick it up and run?
I'll start, because this is kind of
you'd want to start.
My research agenda is called Market Power and Political Power. So I think there is something very interesting for us as an academic community to study. So we had a little bit of a silos approach, the industrial organization side, the political economy side. So we think a lot about markets as IO guys, but we don't think about the political implication. The political economy, they look at that, but they don't think about market structure. So bringing those two together is a very, in my opinion, exciting agenda. And specifically with Andrea Pratt and Bo Cowgill, we looked at 20 years of mergers in the United States, not just the high profile that you may go and discuss in front of the FTC and DOJ, but there is thousands and thousands of smaller mergers across the economy, and we can trace those, and we can see also the lobbying activities, the lobbying money spent by those firms before and after. And of course, as every empirical work, we try to do that in a causal way, and I can give you a figure. We see that mergers in the United States have been directly responsible for an permanent increase in lobbying money of $3 billion every year for the past 20 years. So that's my estimate coming from that empirical work. So is that big? Is that small? To me, it seems a lot of money, but it's also a large economy. But $3 billion come only from merger activities.
Anyone else? John?
Sure. I mean, Ufuk is. I was looking at Ufuk is very knowledgeable. So, I think that we have a problem. We know we have a big problem in our societies, our economies, that there are a small number of firms and individuals who have a lot of financial and political power. And this is having a large influence on the way people get their information and are being influenced by those groups. So I think, as Tommaso said, I mean, if you can amass a lot of market power and get supernormal profits, that enables you then to influence the political process through a wide variety of mechanisms, lobbying, changing the rules of the game. And here in the United States, for example, we know that, in terms of the political, political structures, the Citizens United judgment enabled a lot more money, corporate money, to go into politics and influence the way that elections are held. And that's, also true in many other parts of the world. So I do think this worry about, you could call it creeping plutocracy, is a real problem. Now, is antitrust the best tool to deal with that, or how can the tools of antitrust deal with that? I think that's the big challenge. So Luigi and I have often discussed, I know Luigi is keen on having, when we think about merger standards or other kinds of antitrust enforcement, taking these political issues into account. The thing that I would like to understand is, what are the criteria that we can use in order to make that judgment? I think at the moment, think about the horizontal merger guidelines. We have a set of criteria. You can criticize them, but that's one set of rules that we have for guiding ourselves to make decisions. If you wanted an equivalent set of guidelines for where firms are going to amass political power, I think you'd want to think about guidelines like that as well. So I think we're still a long way away, in my view, from being able to develop those guidelines. But, maybe Tommaso's empirical work or other people's work can help them forward.
Right. But if I may, an example which I think is relevant, we're talking a lot about antitrust enforcement in digital, the big tech companies. And indeed, under the new leadership of the FTC and the DOJ, more cases are being run, finally, after many years. But as I said earlier, this may not change much the picture, because you may double the number of interventions or something like this. So the real battle that was happening here in the United States was during the discussion of the bills in front of the U.S. Congress. And there it was a real battle happening. It was trying to make sure that those bills wouldn't pass. And because that's the way you affect things going forward, by changing the legislation, by giving the enforcer different tools. Otherwise, they can do the best they can with existing tools. And so the lobbying money that was spent at that level to halt any progress on the legislative side.
So I think so. There's definitely a smoking gun here, but being able to associate market power with the political power is very challenging empirically. And of course, without the empirical evidence, it's hard to guide the discussion. But when we look around the world, we see evidence from different countries. Italy was one example, for instance. Or when we look at, for instance, the entrant and exiters in developing countries, for instance, entrants are less productive than exiters. Why? Because competition is not happening only through productivity, it's also happening through their connection to the government. So, there, I think it's easier to identify. In the US, there are some evidence. For instance, Felipe Safi and co-authors, they had an interesting paper showing that those companies that are lobbying heavily, their effective corporate tax is also much lower, for instance. So that would be expected. But in general, I think first we need to agree on what the facts are, right? What the facts are, and clearly, there's especially in academia, we agree that there's a massive rise in concentration, and we are being more and more worried about competition and small business performance in the U.S., which has been the engine of economic growth in the U.S. But, typically people in D.C. are happy about small businesses at the moment because business registry numbers are record high, 5 million. But, those numbers can be high also in India because people are forced to be an entrepreneur just because they can't form promising companies. And right now we are producing jobless companies now. And so we need to be, I think, overall be worried about first what's happening before one can take action. But I have the feeling that, somehow, the rising concentration is also able to communicate that this is nothing to worry about. And I think in the academia, academic circles, we are taking this problem much more seriously. That's a little bit my impression in general.
All right, thank you. Before we move to audience question, I just want to offer a disclaimer I should have offered earlier. I'm currently serving as an expert in an antitrust case. I don't believe it has any connection to anything we have discussed so far or will discuss during the panel, but I just want to be upfront about that. Okay, so audience questions. Could we start right here? A microphone is coming.
Hi, Reenen Fruhar from the Financial Times. Thank you for a great panel. Awesome data points and a lot for me to think about. One thing that I am struggling with as a someone in the media, someone who thinks about all these things from a perspective of an inductive reasoning, and I'm sure that this is true for many people here, every single day of my working life, I deal with the reality of monopoly and political power. You're covering these things. Companies are trying to get you fired or burying you under, legions of lawyers. It's just, you talk to folks in Congress, you talk to their aides, there's cognitive capture. It's just the air that we're breathing. And one thing that's quite frustrating, I find, writing for the FT, wanting to be very data-driven, is how can we work together? Those of you that are looking at this from a sort of a deductive perspective and an inductive perspective, how can we work better together to surface the things that are really going to grab the public imagination in a way that simply makes this work happen much faster and much more easily? And we can all kind of stop pretending that we don't have enough data to say politics and monopoly is a massive problem.
Just for the sake of clarity, could I get you to define cognitive capture?
I would say, and this has been an issue for my entire career, and my 3 books basically look at this, the idea that when you're speaking to experts or policymakers, that they have been so captured by a certain narrative, whether driven by data, whether driven by anecdote, et cetera, that their ability to imagine something else is it's just no longer possible. I mean, I'll give you an example. In my first book, when I was covering financialization, I spoke to a Obama regulator about why Dodd-Frank regulation had been done with 96% of the consultation coming from big banks. And he said, who else should we have been speaking to? That's cognitive capture. There's a lot of cognitive capture right now, and particularly a narrative that is developing at this moment of deglobalization, de-risking, whatever you want to call it, that bigger is better. And that's powerful. It's affecting laws. It's affecting the kind of journalism that we can do. Okay. So I would love thoughts from the panel about how we can work together on this.
Thank you.
I'll try. So it's something you can do and something that we can do. I mean, you should try to get as many sources as possible. So you should go to as diverse conferences as you can. So the fact that you're here is speaking in your favor, and do more of that if you got the time. I know there is a resource constraint. From our side, there is a big problem of coordination because you don't have somebody who represents academia. You have individuals, and we should become also, we should, in a sense, express our research in a way which is less academic, because we're too good as economists to say, well, on the one hand, on the other hand, and he says, so what? I mean, so can you be more specific on what? So we need also to, if we want to have policy impact, to tell where we stand, which is something that as academic we don't do, and we are not collectively organized to present you the views of academia, and instead the lobbyists, etc., they are organized by definition. And the other thing, something that I keep repeating, and it's great that Chad mentioned, these are not that contest, but there is too little disclosure. So the experts don't disclose. Despite we had actually a session last year about this, or 2 years ago, and we still don't disclose. So you have to ask for the disclosure all the time, the funding of the organization, and you have to do your work as a journalist to expose that.
I mean, just picking up on that. I mean, it is true. Like academics, of course, you heard this from the presentations. I mean, our obsession is with we want publications, we want to do our research, and often the problem is that translational type of research, going from what we're doing, digging in the data, working at the what we think is the frontier, the messages for that don't come across. Whereas if you're a motivated agent in the policy world, there's lots of money coming in to do exactly that translational research, to put that thing in front of the staffer to say, oh, this is what you should do. So I think, there is a gap in the market for doing that translational research. Heidi Williams and her work at the Institute for Progress has tried to do that in the innovation space. I think we probably need more of that in the antitrust space. Because I think, my view is, and certainly from the economics point of view, there is a lot of, interest and work going on in these political economic aspects, which is not really, getting out there into the more general policy arena.
I think one thing I want to add on this is that so this discussion requires more and more hard evidence, and I think we were limited with what we could measure in the past. And now, given this whole revolution, digital revolution and data revolution, it allows us to construct brand new data sets. And every day I'm hearing about, and I learn about the new data set through which we can identify new potentially bad behavior or good behavior. And then I think, to me, the speed of recovery of new facts have accelerated so much in the past couple of years, especially on this issue as well. And I think keeping a close dialogue between academia and media and somehow not keeping just, as John mentioned, of course, we are very much focused on publishing papers, but then disseminating those findings would create much louder dialogue, I think, on these issues. And eventually, as the evidence becomes really the dominant fact, then eventually things have to change. I think that's my view on this.
But let me kind of disagree with Ufuk, but maybe we don't even disagree on this one. But when, as academic, we keep pushing for, we need better data, more evidence, we should do things evidence-based, that's all fine, obviously. But this is not what policy is about. There are some policy choices which have to be made here and now. And they cannot wait for 5 years for our results. And that means, especially because a context reflects the distribution of power in that point in time, that whoever holds the most of the power will lead to a decision in a certain way. So still, as academic, even if we have in our hands imperfect information, incomplete, unconclusive, but we've been studying with these bloody things for 20 years, for 25 years. Where do we stand? So we need to come up with a position on things. So we have to take stance in the end, I think.
I 100% agree.
Say, no, I want to be pure, etc. Fine. But then you don't have that policy impact because policy will be dictated by other interests.
I just want to say one thing, and I'm going to give the mic. Strategy. I 100% agree. You guys need a strategy that can counter the strategy that corporations together are pushing into the media. I mean, it's a desperate situation. I can't even tell you.
Can philanthropists here to fund the research?
Yeah, seriously, this is a big deal.
Can I just mildly disagree with Thomas on one thing, just to give a counterexample? I agree with you 100%. Policymakers need to act quickly. And I'm very worried about this because, for instance, post-COVID, small businesses have been struggling drastically, but it doesn't reflect on the numbers. And when you look at the labor market numbers, it's very tight. It looks great, and there's nothing to worry about. But just because we don't have real-time data on small businesses, but now we have digital platforms. They are, and one example is the index that we created with Intuit QuickBooks. On the first day every month, we are putting out an index that uses 5-day-old data on small businesses. And when you look at that index, for instance, what you see is that small businesses have been declining 70% of the time over the past 2 years. And that attracted a lot of attention from policymakers. So if you provide evidence to them, they will react to it. But if you don't, if you just say that, hey, we need to act quickly, there's no data that's quick enough for us to guide us, I think that's a negative approach to this. Maybe the evidence won't help you today, but it will help you next year if you put out some new facts today.
Okay, let's take a question from the middle of the room. Bowtie, Mr. Bowtie, sorry.
Maybe we take different questions.
So thank you very much. I have to point out, my bias is very clear because my background is in public choice economics and new institutional economics. So the idea you could even separate economics from politics is ridiculous. These antitrust decisions are endogenous to the political situations. And the thing I want us to think back to, think about the creation of both the Sherman Antitrust Act. Sherman is tied to people who will directly benefit from that. Just like Sherman was also tried in his earliest antitrust attempt in the telegraph industry in the 86 Post Roads Act, when his brother was on the board of a competing telegraph company with Western Union. From my perspective, we look at some of the historical stuff. If you're going to talk about antitrust enforcement, it's about elites fighting elites. These are both instances where concentrated interests are fighting other concentrated interests. You have to overcome the logic collective action problem as presented by Mansur Olson if you're going to talk about any sort of actual policy implementation that's effectively established.
We're going to try to get through as many questions as possible, so I asked the panelists to one panelist take each question unless there's a quick rejoinder from another then offer that. Anyone want to take this one on? It's kind of a comment as much as a question. Anyone disagree with the premise? Okay. Everyone, we're in line, I guess. Over here on this section. Anyone? Yes, please, in the third row. Over here. Yes, could you hold it? Yeah, thank you. Pass that down.
The Alcoa aluminum monopoly was not ended by the antitrust case against it, but by the fact that the government built aluminum plants that then spun off to Reynolds and other competitors. So I wonder if, considering that there's much talk of a need to ramp up the defense industrial base because of war with Ukraine, war in the Middle East, deterring war in the Far East, and so on, that if that requires an immense increase in expenditure by the government, hopefully with synergies to other uses of industry, how should theorizing about competition, where antitrust would be a subset of that, inform these government investments, some of which would be in R&D, some of which might be actually making, say, chip capacity. And in relation to the R&D, some people talk about where there are more subsidies, there could be less incentive of monopoly. So one could imagine a change of patent law. So because a huge increase in government funding would enable a lot of change for a lot of different areas of law.
Okay, thank you.
How do you see that?
So, yeah, we do seem to be in a new era of industrial policy. Is there a connection between industrial policy and competition policy? Should we think of it as having that relationship? Anyone?
Well, the answer is yes, but I want to mention, so you mentioned that defense and industry. The defense industry is a case in point where we have allowed a phenomenal concentration over time, and the industry became just bad at doing things. So if we had done more competition policy in the defense industry, perhaps the United States would be in a better place now. So did we just neglect it? So we allowed this tremendous concentration with, well, okay, then we didn't. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about 50 years. If you look at the dual sourcing of, but you had Okay. I'm not going to comment.
So on the industrial policy, I think that this is a really important issue because around the world there has been this big move, and we're seeing this big move, like with the Inflation Reduction Act and the Chips and Science Act, towards more industrial policy in the US and other places. And I think the intellectual has been intellectual movement of economists thinking there can be situations in which industrial policy can be beneficial. I mean, it used to be a dirty word in economics to say industrial policy, and I think thinking has shifted alongside the policy, the policy arena. I think that there is a way of doing industrial policy in a way which does actually foster competition rather than hurt competition. We know that the way it was done often in the past, say in Europe in the 60s and 70s, it was to kind of create more national champions. I think the modern way for thinking about industrial policy is to say, well, here's an area that we want to build. It might be in defense, it may be in kind of environmental green transitions. We want to build up those areas, but we set up the system in a way which allows many different companies to compete to provide those type of solutions. So we don't try and drive the money towards a kind of favored supplier. We set up the pool of money, whether it's for kind of defense R&D or whether it's for kind of green technologies, so that many different players can compete for that money. We allocate that with as much independence as we can to try and resist this capturing by politicians and so on. So there's ways that we can do that, but I do think there's a big potential challenge, but I think it can be managed if it's done well.
Okay, back to over here. Yes, in the back.
Hi, Tim Wu from Colombia. Just a comment first. Ran is pointing out the problem of trying to prove the water's wet. I mean, you have something that everybody in government knows is going on, but that is that concentrated industries have a stronger influence over policy. But then it feels hard to prove because it's just like part of the air you breathe, as you say, or the water you breathe. To stick with my metaphor. One kind of sort of random idea I had. This is not my question, but I was like, one way I was thinking, how could you test this? I agree, lobbying expenditures are one thing. You could do an experiment where you try to get phone calls through to people from that's where I noticed it happening. You know what I mean? Who could get a phone call through was like an obvious difference in how concentrated. And, anyway, and obviously there was like some obvious cutoff of who could get a phone call through or get a meeting. So I don't know exactly how you test that. You'd have to do a spy, or do a secret undercover experiment like they do in race relations studies. Anyway, that was just an idea. I had a question, John, and I agree also with this point that, because it's hard to prove water's wet, you can't sit around waiting for 10 minutes, 10 years, say, well, we never know. We don't know if strong companies have more influence over policy. But I don't want to overstate that. I had a question for John about productivity. And I think it's about something that's challenging for antitrust audiences, which is to think about the effect of trade as well. And I wonder, you had that graph of productivity growth, flattening out. And obviously, I think, I'm obviously a big believer in antitrust enforcement. How does trade figure into that entire effect? Was productivity, you think, during the same time going up among Chinese workers or something like that? Or, I'm just curious if you think about trade, how it changes, if at all.
I mean, it's a big question. The trade guys have been spending a long time looking at the effects of globalization on productivity. To summarize this, there's a very nice chapter in our book. It's an advert for Ufuk and I's book by Steve Redding from Princeton and Mark Mellitz from Harvard, which try and look at the overall view on this. And as usual, theory is ambiguous, but the empirics generally find positive effects of trade on productivity. And it's through a number of different mechanisms. One is just by opening up to new export markets, you actually can kind of expand your business. You can pay the fixed cost of R&D. On the import side, there's a kind of increased competition. Again, that's theoretically ambiguous, but in general, that generally has kind of positive effects. It's not, of course, it's not true everywhere and in all cases, but the forces of globalization tend to be ones which tend to be positive for productivity. Now, in terms of the slowdown that we've seen since, say, the global financial crisis, you can't ascribe all of that to the slowdown of globalization that we've seen over the same kind of time period. I'd say that, there's work by Chad, which has, more positive spin, suggests that we're trying to learn how to use new GPTs. There's the overhang of the financial crisis. And there's also a role, I think, for what's happening to productivity. So I don't want to, ascribe all of that to globalization. I think the retreat from globalization is a headwind against productivity growth.
Thank you. Okay, in the middle. Yes, Christina.
It's Cristina Cafara. I'm coming from Europe, so of course my perspective is very colored by that. Going back to the original sort of exam question that this panel addressed, I really want to echo very much a point that Tommaso has made repeatedly. We are seeking to establish whether antitrust has an effect, but what exactly are the actions we are looking at? As Tommaso says, there's very little that actually happens. Merger control is something where the standard is we shouldn't reduce competition. Okay, so we block a few mergers very sporadically. Antitrust conduct, there's 10 cases in 10 years. They go nowhere, the remedies are irrelevant. So I don't know how we would expect to see antitrust having a measurable effect on anything, certainly not in Europe. The question is more whether what we all agree now, we need a change in posture, a much more aggressive enforcement has an impact on intention. And we see that happening because in this country where posture has changed in a material way, I can vouch for boardrooms walking away from deals and saying this is not something we're going to even attempt. There's been a huge fall in mergers that would have otherwise been attempted. So that deterrence is an effect. Number one, and it's very measurable, very sizable. Yes, interest rates being high as deterred in Europe, but the deterrence here is much more significant. The second and final point, which I'll turn into a question, is really this. Narrow as it is, antitrust cannot indeed put points on GDP. This is something I agree with you, and I've said for ages. The issue is really much more whether there is a way in which we can make competition and antitrust an all-of-government purpose. This is the sense in which I quite like what this government is doing, what this administration is doing, which is trying, I don't know how effectively, but seen from the other side of the Atlantic, trying to break silos and infuse notions of competition into trade, into industrial politics, because the train in Europe is coming down the tracks so fast about industrial policy needing to be revived, which I agree with. But, if you read Draghi and Letta, we are in deep trouble, and competition is a side dish, is over there. We don't know what to say about it. So unless competition is really integrated in these other things, I don't see how it can have a very significant impact on GDP. It's got to be a motivating, animating value for trade, for industrial policy, not in and of itself. Certainly in Europe, we do 10 cases a year, in 10 years. What does it do? I
may have missed the question, but anyone want to?
Can I say so? I think that is really what Cristina says is very important. Because I think the attitude towards saying I want to embed the idea of competition across a number of policies, so it's that kind of antitrust spirit, but goes across, is the way to. And if you do look, at these reports, these big reports that Letta and Draghi are writing, I do worry about there's not going to be enough emphasis on that. I think there will be. One example I think where there can be is on trying to deepen and complete the single market. That was a very powerful force, the kind of creation of the single market in the early 90s in Europe to help productivity and help performance in Europe happening. And I think that's the spirit that we need to revive, say, for thinking about services. And that I think is, to me, actually will be more important ultimately than antitrust. If we could actually get the single market reinvigorated and going again, for example.
Okay, right here in the front corner, please. Just a sec for the microphone, please.
Yeah, it's a comment and a question picking up on Rana and Tim and the public choice. Look, every major piece of legislation concerning big business, small business, is going to involve economic interest. They're lobbyists. They're all there. Public choice, the trouble with it is really has very little to do with choice and very little with the public. It's two words put together. The National Telegraph Act, which is misnamed the Post Roads Act, that wouldn't become known until 1900, was the work of John Sherman. And to get to this point about cross-cutting policies, it created an entrepreneurial hothouse that in short term gave us quadruplex telegraph, gave us sound recording, gave us telephone, electric power. That's a pretty effective public policy, National Telegraph Act of 1886. It had unanticipated consequences too. Not antitrust. Antitrust wasn't around yet. John Sherman did devise it, which he had very little to do with the final version of the 1890 Act. It's got his name. But if you're interested in public policy that's efficacious, has long-term consequences, look there. Just to say some lobbyist or some business person was interested in the law, well, of course they are. That's the beginning of the discussion, not the end of the discussion. And for too long, public choice economists have just said, see there, see there, see there, bad, bad, bad. Whereas, in fact, the big money coming in isn't ever discussed, including the money coming to the public choice economists.
Do you have a question?
How can we energize a discussion of the relationship between big money in regulatory policy without becoming trapped in endless discussions about market share and productivity that are not going to shape public policy?
I like discussions of market share and productivity. But anyone else?
Let's get more questions.
Okay, more questions in the back, and then we'll try to do 3 very quickly. So if you could be brief, please. Actually, let's gather 3 questions, and then we'll try to respond to the group.
Hi, Cecile Coors with TIG Advisors in New York. I want to disagree with Christina. I think that there are still mergers going on. Kroger-Albertsons hasn't shut down their effort to merge despite the fact that they're being sued. There are a number of energy mergers going on. The issue is public policy. Now, there's a big effort, we all know, in the U.S. to block mergers, but the courts are not being quite so in line with public policy because they're relying on precedent. So I guess my question is, how does public policy align with what the courts are doing, because we have precedent in the courts?
Thank you. One from the middle, here in front.
Hi, Cory Doctorow from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I would hope that the panel could reflect a little on not just the role that monopoly rents play in capturing policy outcomes, but also the solution to the collective action problem that arises when a sector dwindles to 5 firms who can all gather around a table and then inevitably do. 100 SMEs are a mob who can't agree on where to hold their annual meeting. 5 companies are a cartel who all speak with one voice and a perfect message, discipline, when they speak to policymakers.
Okay, thank you. And then finally over here, Simco, you want to last question, and then we'll throw it to the panel to finish up.
So the evidence being presented, Dan had some case studies. Those seem great. The international evidence seems to have a real flaw, which can be seen in John's figure, is the countries that have been talked about as having the tougher regimes and more active enforcement are in Europe, which has stagnated while the U.S. has continued to grow. And if you're writing a paper that says the international evidence says this is really good and really strong, you would have expected Europe to really outpace growth in the U.S.
Okay, so I'll open it up to the panel. Anyone want to respond to any of those points?
I'll just say, there's multiple causes of things, so it's hard to, say, everything is, all Europe's problems are wider than just antitrust policy. So I guess that would be my response to that question. Let's discuss it over the break.
Okay. Okay, Dan.
Well, I'm going to actually try to synthesize and take a step back to where this panel started. This question of, can antitrust have aggregate effects, right? Particularly through innovation and the diffusion of innovation. And one view, and I'm not trying to say this the only view, but it goes back to something that I think Tommaso said earlier. It's a bit present in the examples I gave, which is that once in a while, maybe, you're like, every 20 or 30 year case, involving major technology companies, right? Like those are the ones that really move the needle in any kind of aggregate sense. Is that demonstrated? Well, it's hard to show systematically because there's so few of them, right? But that may be one way to make sense of a lot of this conversation, tying it back to technology specifically. And so of course, we'll hear a lot more about that in the next panel later. AT&T, IBM, and the political influences there too, and how those evolved with different administrations, et cetera. But again, that's kind of one way that I'm trying to make sense myself of the different things we've heard across the table and around.
Okay, thank you. And with that, we are at time. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And now we're on break.